Well, okay, we've got a good enough house and fascinating topics, so I want to begin by introducing our guest. I'm Stephen Kinzer, a senior fellow here at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. We're happy to have all of you here from Brown and from beyond. This is part of our security seminar series in which we try to focus on issues of global security and bring in people who've had various kinds of experiences. I have to be very careful how I phrase this. So Joe Whipple was with the CIA for more than 30 years, and he's an old colleague of mine. But it's not the way it sounds. We later went on to work together as professors at Boston University. So our joint relationship only began at that point, although I'm coming to realize that I was working as a journalist in Central America when Joe had another job there. So as the nature of his job dictated, we never crossed paths. We're now at a very interesting moment, particularly because of what's happened in the last week. Even beyond that, intelligence has been changing so dramatically in recent years. Our guest has spent more than 30 years in the National Clandestine Service, an operations officer working in several parts of the world. He's taken a very deep and interesting critical view of the CIA while still remaining very closely tied to many of the people and policies for which he was responsible. It's a rare opportunity for us to have an opportunity to hear directly from somebody who's been inside this organization for so long. And so rather than take any more of his time, help me welcome Joe Whipple. Thank you.
I need preparation for something like this, but I will note that I had a 35-year career with the agency, most of it spent in Europe and Latin America. My first tour was in Bonn, West Germany. I'll go into that a little bit, but also a number of foreign places. In addition, was director of congressional affairs for a year. One of the things about popular culture is it shows everybody in the CIA to be nasty, serious, and mean. You'll never laugh as hard in your life as you would if you were a CIA case officer. And I must say, of all the jobs I had, I think I laughed the hardest when I was director of congressional affairs. I wonder why. Anyway. My career at the CIA was divided exactly in half by the end of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, 17 years after I joined the agency. I retired for a second time in 2008 with another 17 years working for CIA. The period after 1989 was much more difficult for not only the CIA but the United States, because the world was becoming more globalized during this period and more driven by interests rather than ideology. This has continued to the present day. Intelligence should have become more important in an interest-driven world rather than an ideological one prior to 1989, but it did not. The 2001 attack on the World Trade Center in New York then drastically changed the mission of intelligence, especially CIA. My first tour in Bonn, West Germany, began in the 1970s and lasted into the 1980s. The Cold War was still going strong, but there were continual efforts in the direction of détente between the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as between individual countries like Germany and the members of the Soviet bloc. Bonn was in many ways a strange place for it to be the capital of a country with 60 million inhabitants. The reason it became the capital was that the home of Germany's first post-World War II leader, Konrad Adenauer, was in a small town on the Rhine between Cologne and Bonn. Before 1933, he had been the mayor of Cologne, was dismissed by the Nazis, and spent the next 12 years working in his garden when he was not hiding out periodically at the monastery of Maria Lach in the Eifel Mountains. During the time I was in Bonn, West Germany had become very prosperous and was governed by a social democratic, free democratic coalition under the leadership of Chancellor Helmut Schmidt. In all the years of my interest in international affairs, I would say Helmut Schmidt was the most substantive leader. He knew a lot about government, finance, economics, defense, and foreign affairs. He was also an excellent public speaker. The U.S. Embassy at the time was the largest American embassy in the world. The French, British, and Soviet embassies were also large. There were 300,000 American soldiers stationed in West Germany, also major contingents of British, French, and Dutch soldiers were stationed there. The Soviets also had an equal number of soldiers in East Germany. Just prior to my arrival, East and West Germany had agreed to exchange representations, quasi-embassies, with each other. They were like embassies, but were not named embassies because of the vain hope that unification would take place at some time. The People's Republic of China had recently established relations with West Germany, and so that event added to the number of diplomats there. The small-town atmosphere is exemplified by seeing Foreign Minister Genscher in a department store with his daughter, running into opposition leader Helmut Kohl and his staff at a Chinese restaurant, Schmidt smoking in the cafeteria of the Bundestag, and cabinet ministers walking along the Rhine with their spouses. The major political issue between the United States and West Germany was the deployment of medium-range missiles, nuclear cruise and Pershing missiles, in Western Europe as a response to the deployment by the Soviets of the SS-20. This was hugely controversial within Germany and much of Europe. The strategy of the West was to deploy while concurrently negotiating with the Soviets to dismantle the medium-range missiles and thereby not need to station the cruise and Pershing missiles. This strategy backfired by permitting the Soviets to argue the United States wanted to deploy and was preparing to fight a nuclear war on European soil. While it was unbelievable that the Soviets themselves would permit a nuclear war against them limited to Europe, many Europeans, especially Germans, believed this to be the case. Schmidt himself first raised the issue of the gap in missile capability in a speech in London. He favored the deployment, but gradually his party, the Social Democratic Party, abandoned him, and his coalition partner, the Free Democrats, switched sides to the Christian Democrats in 1982. They remained out of power until 1998. Sometimes diplomatic relations become personal. Think Obama and Putin. This was also the case in the late 70s. There was a great deal of acrimony between President Carter and Chancellor Schmidt, which did not help the bilateral relationship. Both the Western side and the Warsaw Pact did all they could through influence operations to win the hearts and minds of the German and European populations. Ultimately, this decision was a political one in which the German government of Helmut Kohl prevailed in its belief that West Germany had to follow the lead of the United States. In the 1980s, the good news was that President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Ballistic Treaty in 1988, dismantling all medium-range missiles in Europe. We had won the battle, but the war was a draw. Had the Soviet Union not collapsed, could we have done anything similar in the sense of a controversial policy of rearming again in Western Europe? Maybe yes, maybe no. The issue most similar then during the Cold War and looking into the future of intelligence is the Russians. The CIA's main target in Bonn in the 1970s, as it was worldwide, was the Soviets. But we were not the main targets of the Soviets in Bonn. The Germans were the main targets of the Soviets. It was sort of like a cat chasing its tail. The career pattern of a KGB officer in Germany had started when he was at the university, usually studying German. He then proceeded to sit in Moscow in some office dedicated to Germany before beginning a tour in a German-speaking country, back to Moscow and back to a German-speaking country. This was the same with the diplomatic corps. The Soviet ambassador in 1980 had served as a junior officer in Berlin in 1940 during the Hitler-Stalin Pact. In other words, I never met a Soviet who did not speak the language fluently of the country in which he was serving. Although heavily accented, Putin's German is excellent. At the same time, I have rarely met the wife of a Soviet diplomat who spoke the language of the country. It was informal policy for the Soviets to keep Soviet families close to their compound and segregated. As Americans, we would run into the Soviets at political conventions, but especially at conventions for the youth organizations of the political parties. The example of my experiences, which I just gave, applies to Soviet Russians everywhere. That is, a Russian Arabist will not all of a sudden appear in a tour in Montevideo. The Soviets did very well in agent of influence operations. An agent of influence is not someone you pay or someone you meet secretly, but rather an individual who has views similar to your own, who sympathizes with the views your government holds and is open to supporting those views similar to his own. With an agent of influence, it is possible to formulate his or her opinions. The Soviets had a number of officials who spent a great deal of time in Germany and who had formidable contacts within the political class. The Soviets invited West German politicians to travel to the Soviet Union, where they were hosted generously and provided with high-level contacts within their government. These agents of influence had often enough been POWs in the Soviet Union during World War II. These agents of, in some ways, we did the same, but we're not conscious of it. That is, that American treatment of Germany after World War II created within people a willingness to look at American policies in a positive way. The Soviets were assisted by a number of countries, including East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria. Romania and Yugoslavia were separate. To be sure, one experience I had at a diplomatic function was speaking with a Romanian diplomat. When a Russian joined us, the Romanian turned his back and walked away. There was no love lost between the two. At a young socialist conference, when Wolf Biermann, a poet and entertainer who had recently been ejected from East Germany, was invited to speak, the Soviets and all the other Central European countries walked out. When I asked a Pole, noting the young socialists were most critical of the United States, more so than the Soviet Union, he just answered, "We do what we're told." My own experience with Russians during this period was interesting. When discussing politics with Russians about Germany, they assessed the situation in a reasonable, realistic way. Where they had trouble was on the situation in the Soviet Union and about communism as a system. They would never give an inch on any criticism of the Soviet system. Criticism of their system was verboten. This was also generally true of intelligence officers from other communist countries. They saw their posting Germany realistically, but not their communist system, or what I mean to say is, they could not say what they thought. When I met with Russians in Spain in 1990, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, they were very critical about what communism had done to the motherland. They dreaded going back to Moscow. The Soviet psychological defenses had just simply collapsed. A word about the American embassy in our office in Bonn is warranted. We had 3 excellent ambassadors in Martin Hildenbrand, who was once discouraged by the Department of State after World War II from meeting with Adenauer because he was thought to be a washed-up old politician. He served for 14 years as chancellor. In Walter Stössel, who had a role in the opening to China when he was ambassador to Poland, and Arthur Burns, former head of the Federal Reserve. Burns and Schmidt, an economist, the economists got on especially well. Our office was made up of a diverse cast of characters. We had a Latvian baron, a Slovak immigrant, and an Uzbeki Turk who had been a captain in the Wehrmacht during World War II, Chinese case officers. In addition, we had a number of German and Hungarian Jewish refugees who had served with the U.S. Army in a number of capacities during World War II. This latter group was not only very attuned to political developments in Germany, but how rapidly that country was changing. They were also, without exception, I thought, very pro-German. At the end of my tour, 3 events took place which were to have world-changing effect. The first was the election in late 1978 of John Paul II. I think he represented the real Poland and not the communist apparatchiks in Warsaw. The second was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in January 1979, and the third was the formation of Solidarity and the declaration of martial law in Poland. Meanwhile, the presidency of Ronald Reagan had taken on a more confrontational course with the Soviet Union. Major covert actions were either undertaken or enhanced in Afghanistan and Central America. Looking back, we in the CIA office were still harvesting the fruits of the immediate post-war period when CIA engaged in one of its most effective covert action operations, funding the non-communist left political parties and labor unions. Furthermore, an intelligence agency has some advantages by maintaining contact with the opposition over a lengthy period of time. We had great sources. Our reporting there, combined with the State Department reporting, steered policy in a positive direction on a number of issues, most important, the deployment issue. Later, in Guatemala and Mexico, the same dovetail reporting took place. In my experience, great CIA reporting and great State Department reporting is the key to moving policy in a positive direction. After an assignment in the United States, I was transferred to Guatemala. It was the Cold War. There were no Russians, Central Europeans, or Cubans, but there was a major covert action program, a small effort in Guatemala, and major efforts in Nicaragua and El Salvador. As I look back, the irony is how much political support from left to right our covert action program in Afghanistan had, and how politically controversial the covert action in Central America was. The major theaters in Central America were Nicaragua, where the U.S. supported the insurgency against the Sandinista government of Daniel Ortega, and El Salvador, where we supported the government of El Salvador against the leftist insurgency. The irony, of course, is the unintended consequences of covert action in inspiring radical Islam in Afghanistan, while Central America has continued to limp along with Ortega again in Nicaragua and a former member of the insurgency in power in El Salvador. In Guatemala, the embassy on all levels, including CIA, encouraged at every opportunity the transition from military rule to civilian rule. This occurred in 1986 and has continued to the present day. After the Guatemalan elections, we were visited by Elliot Abrams, a Reagan administration official who has gone on to play a prominent role in a number of Republican administrations. I briefed him on the situation in Guatemala, noting that the election of a president had done nothing to solve or alleviate Guatemala's problems. He answered, yeah, but it solved ours. I say that, Abrams won, Whipple nothing. From there, I was assigned to head a small office in Luxembourg. Luxembourg taught me how important political stability and language were. It is a small country which has influence because of stability and because everyone who is educated speaks German, French, and English. With those three languages, you can go a long way in Europe. Luxembourg is also very wealthy. There were only a few embassies, but included among them were the Soviet and Bulgarian embassies. When I first came, the Bulgarian ambassador was elderly. I think he used to call the Soviet ambassador to ask him if he'd go to the men's room, and so on. He was really a lackey of the Soviet ambassador. And he was replaced by a much younger man with a very attractive wife. He never called the Soviet ambassador except if he had business. He enjoyed very much coming to receptions at the American embassy, although I always made sure he did not bring his umbrella, or at least checked it. His conduct really signaled a change. My office also had a visit from our headquarters by analysts visiting the European Union's Office of Statistics. I remember that they told me in 1988 that the Soviet economy was on the verge of collapse. Goes to show that analysis is a process, not an end result. My next two tours were in Madrid and Mexico City. While in Madrid, the Berlin Wall fell, Germany was reunited, and while in Mexico, the Soviet Union collapsed. Both assignments as deputy led to new intelligence targets, that is terrorism in Spain and counter-narcotics in Mexico. The Year of the Spy in 1985 also led to a new emphasis on counterintelligence. The administration of H.W. Bush ordered global strategic objectives in clandestine intelligence collection, while the administration of President Clinton ordered a narrower and more politically defensible collection priority. The latter ordered an emphasis on terrorism, proliferation, counterintelligence, and rogue states like Iraq, North Korea, and Iran. These targets were considered politically defensible. Ironically, in Mexico, as later in Vienna in the 1990s, the Russians remained active collectors, although their collection efforts were much more directed at economic and political information. In the 1990s, America's espionage capability declined. Budgets were cut and intelligence collection capability was significantly reduced. Internal compromises of the country's capabilities, such as that of Soviet-Russian mole Aldrich Ames, were used by some in the Central Intelligence Agency's leadership as a means to terminate agents and to refocus the agency's operational activity toward counterintelligence. An ambassador told me in Vienna that little was left for the CIA to do after the collapse of the Soviet Union, so the new issues like nuclear proliferation, terrorism, and rogue states served simply to help the CIA justify its existence. He and many others could perceive no other reasonable justification for the CIA's existence. Indeed, the issues left for intelligence collection were of the motherhood and apple pie type, meaning that if an operative was caught or compromised, the mission was easily defensible in the national interest. Espionage directed against terrorism in North Korea or North Korea is easily defensible. But for instance, espionage against perhaps an allied country's economic policy is less so. While the CIA reduced its global presence substantially during the 1990s, the Russians did not, even during the Yeltsin years. Since the attack on the World Trade Center on 9/11, a totally new phase for American espionage has occurred. Covert action, often not truly covert given the size of some of these operations, took center stage, as did the countries of Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, and Iraq. Covert action was one option for President George W. Bush after 9/11. Military force and diplomatic initiatives were others. With the failure, at least inadequacy, of military force and the subjectivity inherent in diplomatic initiatives, covert action has become an option for action, demonstrating Washington's initiative and resolve against the enemies of the United States. Covert action gives the administration an active policy sanctioned by Congress and supported by the American people, free from the need to defend vis-a-vis the press and public the details of every action and activity. Prior to 9/11, covert action was never really popular at the CIA. Covert action was the ultimate example of if it succeeded, the political class would get the credit, and if it failed, the CIA would get the blame. After 9/11, covert action became, in my opinion, popular at the agency. It had great support, public, political support, and was not embarrassing. This is where the CIA is now and will be for a long time to come. It is decreasing covert action in some areas. Concurrently, the upheavals in the Middle East since the U.S.-British invasion of Iraq and the later Arab Spring have led to new covert action findings, modest now, but with the possibility of becoming larger with time. These upheavals have also led to the need for more intelligence on the capabilities, strengths, and ideas of a multitude of groups and parties in that region. But the Middle East is only a part of the world, not the world itself. So in looking into the future of intelligence, I believe covert action will remain a very strong element of it. It is the tool that the president has between diplomacy and armed military force. He will use it. What then is the role for espionage in the years ahead when the United States remains the planet's strongest military power, retains economic might, but is no longer the world's hegemon? There are issues now and for decades ahead which will need long-term consideration. They are not only Russia and China, but also the whole Middle East, numerous East Asian countries, important neighbors to our south, and leading countries in Africa, as well as traditional relations with other countries. These are important issues, but often difficult for American espionage. We have good people and we have resources, that is, we have money. What we lack is enough people fluent in language, knowledgeable about culture, good cover for activities, and time. Mission too often has taken a back seat to career. A 4-year election cycle is not conducive to long-range planning, but that is exactly what intelligence and, in my opinion, diplomacy need. What else is in the future of intelligence? Much U.S. espionage will increasingly involve liaison with foreign intelligence services because transnational issues like terrorism, proliferation, organized crime, and rogue states can only be dealt with on a multinational basis. In some mainly undeveloped areas of the world, the CIA may be able to operate unilaterally against such targets. But in the developed areas, operations are possible only with the assistance of local intelligence services. A tradition among intelligence services has been to act bilaterally. This means two countries exchanging information or engaging in joint operations. This tradition started even before the Cold War. For instance, our relationship with the British. This worked very well during the Cold War and has continued to work on some level since then. However, I believe this must change in order to meet the transnational challenges of terrorism, proliferation, organized crimes, and rogue states. Intelligence exchange and operational activity will have to occur on a multinational level. This will not be easy to transition from bilateral, where everyone knows everyone else and everyone is comfortable, to a multinational level where the comfort level will be different for different players. For example, working with the Russians on terrorism while concurrently the Russians are engaged in covert action against a number of friendly countries. It must also avoid trying to please everyone in the sense of giving everyone an equal seat at the table when an equal seat is not warranted or feasible. Major players against terrorism will need to devolve to work with minor players. For instance, a big country like the UK working with the Irish and Scandinavians. In Central and South America, intelligence exchange centers target against international organized crime will need to be multilateral, and that same goes for East Asia. After each terrorist attack in Europe, for instance, there is new attention given to intelligence exchange. Progress has been made, I think, but it is difficult for me to judge how far and how fast. I do believe the U.S. and other friendly governments should invest in intelligence exchange centers which go beyond just exchange but also undertake multinational operational initiatives against transnational threats. I do not see any alternatives. I had a rich and multifaceted career. On a number of occasions, I was able to see how intelligence, often in concert with diplomacy, was able to influence in a positive direction American policy. Interesting and ironically, not at the expense of another country, but rather in finding and implementing objectives compatible to both. What next? So I thought I'd mention a few things now that we've had a president-elect and thinking about, well, what is the Donald going to do? Well, he's a couple of things that will be of interest. Of course, when a new president comes into office, he has to re-sign the findings, right? Covert action findings. An interesting question for me is going to be, will he sign them all? I think basically President Obama did sign them all. He rescinded, obviously, some like black sites which hadn't been used anyway for some time. But generally, he re-signed the findings, and he signed a lot of findings since then. I don't think any president has engaged in covert action to the extent that President Obama has. But a question for me is, will the Donald continue, for instance, the covert action funding for the moderate opposition in Syria? Maybe he will, but he would tend to think that he will not. Will he support the present Director Brennan's modernization program for CIA, in which he's basically put everybody in a center, in which he's combined the operators in the National Clandestine Service with the analysts from the Directorate of Intelligence? Or will he rescind that and go back to something else? Will he continue the present policy of the president to essentially put a stronger person as the director of the Central Intelligence Agency over his boss, the Director of National Intelligence, right? Director of National Intelligence now is General Clapper, fine person, but the Director of Central Intelligence is John Brennan, a close, basically I would say not only associate, but almost friend of the President. President Obama began his administration with Admiral Blair as the Director of National Intelligence. But he made his Director of Central Intelligence, Leon Panetta, who was a senior member of Congress, number 3 in the Democratic leadership, was the head of the Office of Management and Budget. He was also the Chief of Staff to President Clinton. In other words, on all 3 levels, with first Panetta and then General Petraeus and now Brennan, he has appointed people who are essentially more powerful than his Director of National Intelligence. Question you might ask is why? Well, the President is a constitutional lawyer, and I think he sees, or has seen, the CIA to be his tool. Now, will the Donald do the same thing? I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch. What is his viewpoints on covert action? Is he going to rescind modernization and redivide the operators from the analysts? And who is he going to choose as his director of CIA and as his director of national intelligence? And what is the power relationship going to be between them? Now, he's also said that that torture works. And we could get back into the torturing business. General Hayden has remarked that if anybody ever wants to do that again in the future, they better bring their own bucket, because CIA certainly isn't going to do it. And I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen in that regard. And I'm not sure he does on a lot of these type of issues. But certainly the major ones that we've mentioned of transnational issues, rogue states, are going to remain current, and to have a very vibrant, intelligence service, I think, is certainly worthwhile. So with those comments, I'm certainly ready to try and answer any questions that I can.
Let me take the privilege of office and ask the first one, Joe. For the first half century of its existence, the CIA was not an agency focused on killing people. If they killed people, it was very rare and targeted very specifically. Now the CIA is into the killing business in a big way because they run the drone program.
Right.
Is this a correct, is this the right place for the drone program, or does it eat away at the core functions of the CIA?
I think, the problem, there's a couple of problems here. First of all, the legal ones. The CIA engages in that type of covert action, or any covert action, under Title 50 of the public law. The military under Title 10 of the public law. And I think it's easier in a lot of places, like for instance Pakistan, to have the CIA do these things because drones, even if they are under the table agreed to, are officially condemned by Pakistan as opposed to Afghanistan. The killing of Osama bin Laden was done under CIA authorities. And that SEAL team was essentially seconded to CIA during the operation. Another aspect of this is, and this is kind of an interesting one, I think there's that kind of tendency to try and bring more of these things under the U.S. military, where it's thought that there would be more oversight. But I don't agree with that. I think there's more oversight when it's under the intelligence committees of Congress. I think the armed services committees are, I think they basically will do whatever the Defense Department wants them to do. And there's been a lot of opposition, especially from the vice chairman of the committee, who's been there now, on there in about 14 years now, Senator Dianne Feinstein of California, to maintain as much of this under CIA authorities. Do I personally I agree with that? And my viewpoint is no. I mean, I think that should be more military, and I think we should focus more on espionage than covert action. But I think that's the reason why it's done. Yeah.
I was very interested in your closing comments about potential return to torture. Your comment suggested that the CIA would balk, at least publicly say over our dead bodies. I hope that's the case, but I find myself begging the question, they didn't balk the first time, or whenever the first time was, but let's say the early 90s. I mean, the early Bush administration, not the 90s. So what has changed? It's not like there's been this massive personnel overhaul within the CIA. If anything, it's expanded greatly. Is there a change in attitude, or is there an embarrassment from public scrutiny, or what's your evaluation of the likelihood of it not returning in practice, even if publicly denouncing it?
Well, first of all, I'd say yes to almost everything you said. I got to admit that, after that 2001, after the 9/11 attack, for a number of years, I consider that there was almost a herd instinct in not only CIA, but in government in general, and that's very dangerous, in my opinion. As, some people like former acting general counsel of CIA, John Rizzo's friend and a good guy, but he keeps bringing up, well, you don't remember what the situation was really like in 9/11, were we going to attack again, and so on. I really don't buy that. It was a bloody nose and extremely nasty and so on and so forth. But our reaction to those events, I think, were way overdrawn. And if something like that happens, I think what you got to try and do is hurt them more than you hurt yourself. And I think on a multitude of levels, we hurt ourselves more than them. I think some of in the aftermath of all those things, obviously there's people have thought about that, realized that a number of these things were wrong. And by the way, they stopped waterboarding before it became public. I think just because they started feeling, oh, this isn't such a good idea, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and so on. But I kind of wish I were the fly on the wall, and wish I knew who were those people sitting around a desk saying, or around a table saying, yeah, let's go do this. And was there anybody who said, no, I'm just not going to do that? I think it's a very regrettable thing. Pardon? Well, there was the Bush administration, but there had to be people at CIA, who basically got around. They got the authority from the Bush administration. They got the authority from the Office of Legal Counsel through the Bybee memo, and so on and so on. That I know. I mean, that we all know. But who sat around? Who were the half dozen or 10 people who sat around a table at CIA and said, "Yeah, let's go do this"? And was there anybody who said, "I'm not doing that," and walk out on them? That's what I'd like to know.
What reassurance? I don't feel reassured by your comments. As an American citizen, I worry that somehow Mr. Trump may succeed in bringing back waterboarding and worse, as he's promised to do, and that I don't know that I am confident that he won't find a way to make it happen.
Again, I can only repeat that there would probably be a lot of opposition within CIA and government, et cetera, to do that again. But we don't know. The president has a lot of authority, and people who have power have always find people who are willing to do their bidding. I mean, that's human history, regrettably. Yeah.
My understanding from the internet that you're probably 4 times more likely to be struck by lightning than to be killed in a terrorist attack in this country. And given that relative, and that's the way I feel frankly when I live in Providence. I don't feel like I walk outside and
I don't either in Watertown, Massachusetts, yeah.
And given that relative lack of threat, I guess I am concerned, and I'm all for pursuing ISIS and international threats in coordinated effort with other countries. But I do have concern about Trump and, for example, his appointment of Flynn as the new national security.
He did that already?
Yeah, he did.
Oh, okay.
That's my understanding, maybe I got that wrong, but I am concerned about the Flynn mentality and what that would do in terms of our interventionism in the Middle East. I certainly don't want to be back with a President Bush type of entanglement, and I'm concerned about what the Trump-Flynn type administration might end up doing relative to the absence of a real terrorist threat in this country.
Yeah, got me. I mean, I don't know what they're going to do. What they say they're going to do is not get as involved. I could envision dealing with Putin and Assad in Syria, but beyond that, it's anybody's guess on what they're going to do. But yeah, good luck on that one. Yeah. The Donald is hard to assess. Yeah.
I'm a Turkish citizen, and I'm here for a brief time. In Turkey, there is big discussion about CIA supporting Fethullah Gülen and his schools all around the world. At some Turkish schools, whose leader is a religious figure. And this person is a criminal person who tried to destroy the Turkish democracy last July, and he's being protected by CIA in Pennsylvania.
Well, I've heard those type of things, and I don't know if he has any protection. He may have some kind of protection. I almost certainly not CIA protection. If it was any kind of protection, it'd be the FBI.
There was an FBI man in the Turkish television who spoke English, and he said that he was brought to Washington, D.C. and to Pennsylvania by American military planes from Turkey.
It's always hard to know. I know nothing about that, and I doubt it. I doubt it very highly. Yeah.
I want to ask a question about the origins of the CIA. So, very much the CIA was founded in a period of great uncertainty and anxiety in the US. First, perhaps after the Pearl Harbor attacks, the OSS was founded, and then afterwards, at the start of the Cold War, the CIA, as we know it today, was founded. So, I was wondering how relevant the origins of the CIA can explain the development and eventually perhaps the workings of the CIA today.
Actually, quite a bit. I mean, first of all, the U.S. was the kind of the last major country to have an intelligence agency. MI6 was founded in 1912, MI5 in 1909. So, we were kind of last on the scene for an intelligence agency. I mean, the thing that General Donovan did with OSS that is really unique to CIA, it's the only organization that combines analysts with operators in one organization. The only other intelligence service like that is the German service, because we founded it after World War II. And not only put them in the same organization, but treated them the same way administratively. In other words, according to status and promotion. Which is, I think very interesting. MI6, for instance, is only operators. The DGSE in France is only operators. The SVR in Russia, with MI6, they collect information and then they give it to another body called the Joint Intelligence Council. Mossad, for instance, is only operators. And then most other countries of the world have a domestic intelligence collection service. in the United States, it's the FBI that does that, but they have arrest powers. Other domestic intelligence collection services, which are everywhere actually, except the U.S., do not have arrest powers. They are basically intelligent, they collect intelligence on groups, that the government considers could be some kind of threat to public order. And that's small countries, big countries as well. So that's where this very unique, putting together analysts and operators, which Director Brennan has actually tried to blend in centers. I'm not favorably inclined toward that, but I think certainly it's part of a certain type of momentum that started in World War II. Yeah.
A theme throughout your talk seemed to be the negative effect of political pressures on the CIA's decision-making. Do you think there's a way to insulate the agency from that without removing the checks and balances?
Really, no. I think that's just the political class comes in with an agenda, usually. Although I'm not too sure if this one is coming in with an agenda, especially on foreign policy. I mean, I really am. You kind of don't know where they're at, but almost always they come in with some kind of agenda, and they want intelligence to fit that agenda. I mean, the intelligence that was used to initiate the war against Iraq in 2003 was, thin, shallow would be, adequate descriptions of. It was basically used, to go to war. That was their agenda. They, and I've had a lot of disagreements with people on how that was formed and so on. There's one thing there's one bottom line. These guys wanted a war. That's all there is to it. Right. It's just, they wanted a war, and they got one. Intelligence that was produced, warning them about the pitfalls of occupying a country like Iraq was just completely ignored because they had a vision of something else. Now, sometimes the political vision does take precedent. You got to remember, as elections count. I mean, elections count, and, we elect this guy or whoever it was, and, somehow thereafter you have to live with it. On the other hand, I have seen, certainly and experienced occasions in which intelligence changed policy or modified policy in a positive way. I think, a real key in all this is, just how educated your political class is. I mean, the former senator from Illinois, Adlai Stevenson, once wrote, he says, it's not just smart people who have to produce intelligence, it's smart people who have to read intelligence. And by smart people, they mean not IQ smart people, but people who have a background, have a good education, have judgment, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, it's always going to be a conflict between intelligence and policy. But the role of an intelligence agency is basically to lay it down and say, this is the way we see it, and walk away from it. I think probably if there was, something, and this happened, I can understand in a way how it happens, was that, Director Tennant became part of the team rather than being the guy who said, well, we really don't know that. Yeah.
Aren't you encouraged by the fact that President-elect Trump knows more about ISIS than all the generals?
Well, he is, he's, let's put it this way, on the surface, he's not lacking in confidence. But sometimes you wonder what's under the surface, if there's not a terribly insecure human being there.
Joe, can you tell us a little about where the CIA now fits into our general intelligence picture? It used to be that the head of the CIA came in every morning to brief the president, and that was an intimate relationship that wasn't challenged by anyone else. Now we've got more than a dozen intelligence agencies, and we've got a security apparatus and private contractors that spills all the way off into Northern Virginia. You see it on the side of the road when you're driving in from Dulles Airport. And even John Kerry remarked recently, some of these programs are on autopilot. So, does the CIA have a very different role now from the principal role as an intelligence gatherer that it had during your time there?
It's much more of a covert action agency. There's no doubt about that. I mean, it's hugely engaged in covert action. Regarding the proliferation of these organizations and of staffing, the Washington Post journalist Dana Priest wrote a book about this, and she was giving a talk over at MIT. So I went over there and I said, "Is any of this a surprise?" And she said to me, "Well, all of you guys tell me that." Well, of course, we know that because in that sense, we were in the inside. I think regarding using intelligence, it's very different from president to president. President Clinton took the president's daily brief, did not meet with briefers, but then had a lot of questions on the brief, and they got back to him and answered it. The Vice President Gore was very, very good intelligence. Was very interested in the intelligence and very loquacious and asking a lot of questions. President George W. Bush took the president's daily brief, and with the briefers and the director of CIA until it changed to the DNI. And then the DNI started going down and briefing him. And he was very punctual. He liked oral briefings, and he liked deep what they call deep dives on various issues. President Obama, being a modern person, reads the president daily brief on his computer, and then the briefers come in the morning and talk to him. I think certainly as far as the product of what's in the president's daily brief, affectionately known as the book, which is basically the president's own newspaper, is still, I'd say 80 to 90% CIA material from clandestine sources, from signal intelligence sources, from open sources, from imagery, from the National Geospatial Agency imagery. Now, it's going to be very, very interesting to see how the Donald does all this. Now, the briefers are going up there. Are they meeting with him? What are they telling him? And how is he responding? I have no idea. Generally, when presidents come into office, they start getting that president's daily brief, and they say, "God, do you guys know all this stuff?" After a few years, they say, "Can't you tell us anything new? Can't you give me the answer to this?" And I mean, there was that famous statement by the Defense Secretary Rumsfeld: "We don't know what we don't know." That's wrong. We do know what we don't know. Finding out what we don't know is the hard part. Finding out what is going on in the minds of Kim Il-sung, in North Korea. We don't know that, and a lot of other things. But we, obviously are trying to find out what those answers are. But it's a very interesting process. We'll see how this works out. Yeah.
You mentioned a little bit interagency and international sharing and cooperation. Could you talk a little bit more about the direction that you think that's headed, and in particular how that's different in the U.S. than in other countries due to the sheer size of the U.S.
We're, compared to anybody else, as I understand it, we're really doing well. These, with all the money we put into it, we probably should be doing well. But if you're talking about like the fusion centers, which work on a federal, state, and local level, I mean, they've been very important in protecting us, to a maximum. When I'm asked about these type of things, I think we can't be 100% safe, but as a matter of fact, we are very safe. I think if there's a problem, It is on the international level. And, you know, the Europeans have been under the gun for a long time, you know, to exchange more information. And they just find it really hard to do, and they're very dependent on us, you know, for that information exchange. And I think they've done a lot, they've gotten better, but they still have a long way to go to get close to where we are. Meanwhile, their issues are more severe than our issues because of the difference between the various countries in the European Union. The fact that the Middle East is obviously a lot closer to them, and there's ways of getting in, and so on. So they have a long way to go, and I think that's it's never going to be 100%. And every time there is some kind of thing that happens in the United States, some kind of terrorist attack, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? And so on. And it's you can always get better, but it's never going to be perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, you seem to have a fair amount of faith in covert action as being a good way to move forward.
I didn't say that. I said the president has the authority, and he likes covert action.
Okay, but I guess my concern is that looking back, especially during the Cold War, a lot of our covert actions, especially in Central and South America, created big messes in this country and a lot of unfortunate blowback for the U.S. The same is true in Afghanistan. And I'm wondering how you think the CIA can avoid that kind of, creating that kind of mess going forward if we're going to focus more on covert action.
I don't think it can, as long as the president has the authority to order CIA to engage in covert action. He has a lot of authority. He has to do it in essentially by informing the Congress of his covert action. He has to inform, you know, what it all entails, you know, how much it's going to cost, if they're going to do it with anyone else. So, you know, but as long as this is a tool that a president has, they're going to use covert action. Now, on the examples that you cited, I mean, are really good examples because, like I say, I think before 9/11, CIA never liked covert action. Gets you in trouble. It has the unintended consequences that you just mentioned. You know, it's a tool that the president thinks, oh, he's going to get something done, but it winds up exploding in his face. But I think since 9/11, that's changed. I mean, because the popular support is so strong on behalf of covert action, congressional support is very strong on it, and all those covert actions, they are all ordered by the President of the United States, and they are funded by the U.S. Congress, the people we elect. Interestingly enough, is I think the one time there was a downturn in covert action, it was when President Carter was elected, and he wound up signing off on the biggest covert action program in U.S. history, the one in Afghanistan. So it's there, it's part of the law. I think you know, President Obama, in my view, views it in preference to sending 150,000 of our soldiers running around Central Asia or the Middle East.
How about the option of just staying out of the business of other countries?
That's elect guys who do that. I think CIA would be more than happy. That's and the next time that there's an explosion somewhere in the U.S., they'll go by the board. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead. Yes. Yeah.
Between all these international agencies, is there a mechanism to avoid redundancy and sort of establish spheres of influence almost in regions of the world where, you know, certain countries in charge of collecting intelligence and then they're sharing from there? Is there any mechanism of that sort?
Well, you know, CIA can only operate overseas, and you know, the FBI can only operate in the U.S., but there's FBI overseas, you know, legal attachés, and you know, we have officers in the U.S., you know, targeting foreign nationals. But I think it's pretty well divided.
With other international intelligence agencies?
Oh, international. Oh, well, yeah. I mean, there are agreements with you know, with the Five Eyes services, which are, you know, Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. You know, there's no spy agreements. and certainly the close cooperative effort with those services. And then, it's pretty close with NATO services, very close with Mossad, and so on. And then it kind of, goes down after that. So, overseas, for instance, I always had contact with the Brits, often with the French, Germans, Mossad, the Israelis, Dutch, and so on. And you do, kind of, talk a lot about common objectives and trying to help one another. Also, what I forget, one thing I should mention is that, maybe the biggest part of, an espionage service is liaison with other intelligence services. In Britain, MI5, MI6, Scotland Yard, GCHQ, which is their NSA counterpart, and so on. So you have liaison relationships with intelligence services all over the world. And again, on these transnational issues, I think there's never going to be a substitute for that. I was in Spain, when Pan Am 103 went down, and you get this cable saying, oh, you guys get it involved in counterterrorist stuff. And, well, we have 8 case officers, and they have 5,000 people in their security services, So what are we going to do in a decentralized country of 40 million people when they, basically you've got to go to them and say, we got a terrorist problem here, and we'll help you, and, we'll exchange information. So lots and lots what you do is with liaison services. Yeah.
I have a question about what the composition is of the CIA. Earlier you mentioned a herd mentality. And I'm curious, when it comes to background and training over time, how employees at the CIA have changed. So, are their backgrounds technical? Is it rather diverse?
Yeah, I think it changes a lot according to the targets that are out there and the languages that the agency needs. Although I think we've always been weak in language, even in the modern European languages. But certainly there's a, recruitment, they want Chinese linguists and Persian linguists and Dari linguists and Korean and Arabic, is very strongly emphasized. So the recruitment of those type of people for non-proliferation subjects. If you have a master's degree in physics and are a personable guy, you're worth your weight in gold, because one of the things that you're always chasing around is people who are trying to, build weapons of mass destruction, and so you have that ability to walk the walk and talk the talk. So a lot changes according to the needs of these intelligence services, and I would say that goes worldwide for other intelligence services as well. So if you know the culture, you speak the language, great thing to have. Yeah.
So I was wondering whether you could comment on what you see as the biggest challenges for intelligence gathering in conflict zones, in particular as the U.S. military is more doing airstrikes and air operations. So, what are your thoughts?
That's the biggest challenge for us, and I don't know if we can ever really deal with this challenge, is looking ahead. And that we simply don't do. And it's just, maybe it's too hard. We had no agents in Iraq before the Iraqi war in 2003. You know why? Because you start out, if you want agents now in some place, you got to start now for 30 years from now. But we don't do that. We kind of live for the moment. And a lot of the things we do, in my opinion, is just because we're so powerful. We can let a lot of things slide. A third of our ambassadors are political ambassadors. They don't know anything about diplomacy. I've worked for a bunch of them. Really, and it's just really, it's really incredible. And I've met, in Washington, the German, French, British, Dutch ambassadors, those are real professionals. A number of ours, they'll speak the language, they've never been there, they get to be called ambassador and so on. But that looking ahead, which I think is really important, and in a way, if you have a director of CIA say to the president, listen, half of our effort has to be, for things going to happen 10, 20, and 30 years from now. I remember Director Goss tried to get a gathering together in Congress to talk about Venezuela. No one showed up. I mean, a couple of staffers did, but none of the representatives, because it's right now. Everything is right now. What's happening right now? And I guess as long as we're as strong as we are, I guess you can kind of get away with that. But it's not really the right way to do things either.
Did CIA know about the collapse of the wall in Berlin? Because the world was not expecting this, and it happened all
No.
of a sudden, and you were working there at that time.
No.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, did CIA know about the fall of the Berlin Wall? The answer is no. Actually, it would have been interesting to see if Rick Ames basically cleaned us out of all our agents in the Soviet Union. I mean, he basically compromised everyone, and 10 of those people were executed. It would be interesting to know if one of those people could have been able to tell us that there's, some things are really going on. Certainly the analysts were at the point where they knew that the Soviet economy was at the point of collapse. But I don't think anyone knew that the Berlin Wall was going to fall. But I had a great experience in September of 1989. The director of Central Intelligence, Judge Webster, came to Madrid and for talks with the service, and they were going to talk about Cuba and North Africa and so on. And General Manglano, who is the head of the Spanish service, starts out the thing. He says, I know what we were supposed to talk about, but what's happening in Europe? By that time, the Solidarity had taken over the Polish government. The Hungarians had opened their border. The East Germans had occupied their embassy in Prague, and poor old General Webster, who was a judge from Missouri and had been head of the FBI, you tell him, and so on. So at any rate, it was the one thing analysts tend to miss is momentum. It's, you tend to think it's going to be the way it was. There's that one official in the British government who was there like for 50 years, and they finally said of him, every year he predicted there would be no war in Europe, and he was only wrong twice. And so on. So it's, but it was I must say, when that wall came down, and this is actually a good lesson for us all, especially young people. And sometimes you get into these intractable problems that you never think are going to be solved. But I was in Luxembourg in August 13th, 1986, and I didn't have anything to do one afternoon, and I was tired, and I had a couple of beers for lunch, so I couldn't work. And so I watched television, and there was about a 3-hour program on the building of the Berlin Wall because it was the 25th anniversary. And the impression you had from that is it's never going to come to an end. 3.5 years later, it was gone. So anytime I get really pessimistic about almost anything, I try and remember that. Different people, different events, different situations, and smart people who can take advantage of that can lead up to really big changes. And anybody who spends time in Europe knows how nice it was that wall came down.
And how nice it was that they had good people making right decisions in high places.
Oh,
if
I mean,
only,
I
if only.
I think it was a diplomatic masterpiece by the American government. And not only there, but the first Iraq War, the normalization of relations with Mexico that I was a part of, the collapse of the Soviet Union and how that was handled. I mean, they did a masterful job.
Well, we won't be using that word anytime soon for our foreign policy. Thanks so much for joining us.